Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to IDSA and the other sponsors for inviting me to this session. Gives me an opportunity to think about what India's Look East policy and the role of Northeast states can be. And may I start off by actually just taking forward the thought that Mr. Yuthan Tun carried on, which is that the necessary condition for Look East policy is the Look Myanmar policy. To make it even further sort of more sharper, which is that I see this in 3 stages, which is that India needs to have a genuine Northeast policy, and then a Myanmar policy, and therefore then after that a Look East policy for the ASEAN. So I see that actually is in 3 stages, and I've said this earlier a little flippantly that India does need to sign a free trade agreement with itself before it starts getting into free trade agreements with others. And that is very true of the northeastern states, which is that just recently we had a lunch on the Northeast issue with some Japanese friends, which we have sort of institutionalized as a monthly lunch, and we had some friends from the Northeast there. And it emerged very strongly that the states of the Northeast of India don't really see eye to eye with each other. There's a lot of mistrust still. There is lots to be done within the borders. Those borders divide. They don't connect. There is lack of connectivity within themselves. So I think the focus on Northeast and developing the Northeast, as a region, as an entity, has to be much sharper before India really wants to be serious about its own Look East policy or India-ASEAN agreement in relationship and trade. And here I think the second stage, which I should have mentioned before even Myanmar, is really Bangladesh. Without bringing in Bangladesh and without creating a regional entity of our 7 states with Bangladesh, there is possibly no way forward for India's Look East policy. So I think it's a kind of a necessary condition that India must develop its transition arrangements, its border arrangements, and connect this part of India to the eastern part of India through Bangladesh before we can think about India's Look East policy. And I think here I just want to talk about a little bit about hardware, because I think there is a lot of focus in our discussions mostly on hardware, which is connectivity, marine, roads, energy, etc. And I want to focus on the software very soon. But one thing that is very clear, the 2 things that need to be done. One is that India needs to develop regional projects which involve everybody, which is, for example, what I have in mind is, let's say, the rivers of Eastern Himalayas. How to bring that together, because they affect all these countries in that region. Is that a project that we can do? And the second one, and which is, the connectivity is important, because so that we can get borders, which don't divide, but which are open and which connect. Here, very often in economics, we think about what are the external impetus, or what is the drivers of change for this region. And unless you get those drivers of change, I don't think you get those change. And luckily for us, I think the both external and internal drivers have emerged. And the external driver, which I was hoping somebody would mention, and it's like the Banco's ghost, is of course the rise of China in this fact. And which is, I remember that the rise of China has created the impetus for both countries like India and Japan, and now actually even the ASEAN countries, to get this India-ASEAN relationship in much greater focus than what it was earlier. 3 years ago, I had proposed a project to the Japanese to start a sort of conversation, seminar, etc. on the northeastern side, and they were reluctant to do so because of what it might do to Chinese interest and how the Chinese might look at it. But luckily now I think all those things are changing, and therefore there is an external impetus for this cooperation. The internal one is, of course, the rising inequality within India, between the northeast and the other mainstream, the main sort of major parts of India. And I think this inequality is unacceptable, is creating political force to change that. And therefore I think, and our relationship with Myanmar and Bangladesh, which I consider internal to our India-ASEAN situation, is also changing. So the drivers of change are there, and therefore I think what didn't look feasible some years ago will begin to look feasible now. As I said earlier, I would like to just one other part on the hardware side, on the connectivity. And Mr. Bezwarwa, I think, mentioned it, which is the air link. And here I propose a viability gap funding for the air links to Northeast and to Myanmar. And unless that happens, it will be very difficult for us to create those links because commercially they may not be viable. And the viability gap funding idea is a very straightforward one. On the air links one, the private airlines can then be induced to get into the act because it will have to be done through private investors and entrepreneurs that the development of this connectivity takes place. I think my major point, Mr. Chairman, and I'll end here with the 2 points really. Just one is that we need to focus much more on the software side, which is the change in the mindset, the change in the building the trust, removing the mistrust amongst each other. And for that, what I have been suggesting to several of our partners, etc., is to start a series of conversation which will bring first the Indian 7 states together and then their partners of Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh and Myanmar, and in a sustained manner and not in a once-off manner, because unless there is a conversation within this, unless there is the agreement on doing things behind the border, whatever you might do in physical hardware or physical connectivity terms will not work. Because as I've seen with the initiative of ADB in SASEC, this initiative that they took, it's been there since 1997, and yet there is no genuinely regional project in that area at all, because behind the border actions do not get taken. And the final point is that I think Mr. Bejwaru again suggested that or hinted at that, but I'm making it very explicit, which is that the conversation about the Northeast and or the Look East must shift physically to the region, must shift physically to the east, as it were. Because I am trying this out in a project that is called India and Her Neighbors, which is to take the conversation, which is to take the discussion of the relationship between India and her neighbors to the capitals of our provinces, which is Bihar and Patna and Kathmandu, Guwahati and Dhaka, Kolkata and Dhaka, etc. So that maybe I am it's foolhardy to suggest, but maybe in the end I should suggest that it is time that the Delhi dialogue became a Kolkata dialogue or a Guwahati dialogue or a Northeastern dialogue, because unless you are there physically, Northeast from here is so far away, it could be anywhere. And the reality doesn't come home. And I think maybe it's time, therefore, to have the 7th dialogue, call it the India-ASEAN dialogue, but hold it within the region, so that the focus of all those who are visiting there comes sharply to the constraints and the potentialities of that region, which is the first condition that we have to solve before we think about India-ASEAN relationship. Thank you. Sure.